Welcome to Pharmacy View podcast, where we provide regular interviews with pharmacists and key people within Australian pharmacy and the associated global industry. In this stream of podcast episodes, we discuss with our guests the full scope of leadership tools that go into building the pharmacy leader's toolbox for team and career success. I am your host, Chantelle Turner, pharmacist, leadership coach, and founder of Turn Pharmacy Leadership. My guest today is proudly brought to you by Shopfront Solutions for all your shelf and digital marketing needs, part of the Arion Technologies Group.
I think closing that loop helps you to progress as well. And we really wanted to hear from everyone whether we were on the right path as well with what was intended in that meeting. Especially, I think having consumers in the meetings as well really added another level to the meetings and discussions as well to hear their viewpoints. So not just from the pharmacists in the meetings, but also the consumers that were there, which then, it just added to that robust discussion. And I think you're right as well. Having everyone aware of the clear process and that their viewpoints were heard really helped with that as well, which is what we wanted in terms of how we were putting together the groups, having pharmacists working in different practice settings to give different opinions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this episode where I have Jake Warner. And to introduce Jake, he is an experienced community and clinical pharmacist with a vast array of experience in clinical writing and editing. Where he's worked is pretty impressive as well. I worked at organisations including the Royal Pharmaceutical Society of London as a clinical writer for the British National Formulary and also the Therapeutic Guidelines. These days, Jake is currently employed as a CPD Manager at the Pharmaceutical Society of Australia, and I'm super excited to talk to him today, predominantly about our new professional practice standards and how they are developed, but also exploring anything else that comes to light. So welcome so much, Jake.
Thanks, Chantelle. Nice to be here.
It's so good. We've been planning this conversation for quite a while and we've finally made it happen. So I'm sure we're going to have lots to talk about.
COVID got in the way a little bit there as well.
Yeah.
Read its head.
The gift that keeps on giving. In that little intro, I said that your current role is the CPD Manager at the PSA. So just give us a bit of a background. What led you to that role in your career?
I think I kind of fell into it, I guess. I think when I finished uni, I did start working as a sessional academic at university as well. I really enjoyed the teaching kind of aspect.
Yep.
Worked in clinical pharmacy as well. And then I think I was actually going to have a break from pharmacy, moved to the UK, and then fell into the publishing kind of writing area. And when I did that, I just found quite a passion for, I guess I found a bit of a niche in terms of I really like clear, concise communication and education. And I really enjoy the clinical, being able to use the clinical part of your brain as well, or knowledge. And then, PSA, just applied for a role that was at PSA. Was working in the practice support team with guidelines and APF, and then moved into the CPD role. So it's been a really interesting journey, and it's a big role, and I'm enjoying it. But
The reason why I originally reached out to you was because I saw that you were involved in the development of the professional practice standards. And when I read the list of advisory group members and the reviewers, it was an absolute who's who of people in pharmacy. And I assume that working with such people was truly incredible, but also maybe challenging when we have such strong, passionate, and incredibly talented people in the room all at once. So can you set the scene for how the process worked and where your role fitted in the development of the standards?
Yep. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there as well. We had a lot of influential and who's who people in pharmacy, and we obviously reached out to them to be part of the standards as well. And we did put out a open call for all pharmacists to nominate to be part of the development as well. I think in terms of the setup, so I was the project lead, so I was leading the project, and we had multiple different groups. So to set the scene a little bit, we had an internal working group, a project advisory group, which gave the oversight to the whole project, and we had standard review groups made up of different pharmacists as well as consumers. There were 3 separate standard review groups, and we also had an external, not pharmacy related, I suppose, but an external digital company to produce the implementation program, and an external writer that helped with the content as well. So I guess my role was to bring all the groups together and make sure we were all achieving the aim that we were trying to get to. But I think the aim that we started off with at the start continually changed, which was also a challenge. And I think a nod to everyone that was involved in terms of their ability to flex with us and go on the journey, because I think we started the project thinking we're just going to do a light touch, and we ended up with a complete overhaul. But I think also we had some great chairs. So each SRG and PAG had an individual chair. So the chair for the PAG was Deanna Mill. And for each SRG, we had Anne Todd, Hannah Knowles and Andrew Sluggett. So they were chairing the individual SRG meetings and the PAG. And so I think it worked really well. And there's definitely differing opinions and challenges that come with it. And I think that was what we wanted as well. We really wanted to put together groups with people from different areas of pharmacy. So I think, imagine taking a splice across the whole profession and taking a bit from each part and then putting them all together into one room to discuss different standards, so that we could really get a good product at the end, which applied to all pharmacists in all practice settings.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think it's really a living, breathing example of the power of enabling diversity in the workplace or within teams to achieve amazing outcomes. And I can only speak from my personal opinion, but reading the standards, I found it amazing how something that was without doubt incredibly complex seemed incredibly simple and clear and concise, to use your desire around communication styles, which is going to be really implementable for pharmacists and people coming into our industry as well. So I guess you mentioned there was the chairs and there was a whole raft of people that sat in each of those groups. How did you go about ensuring that everyone had a voice through the process?
Yeah, I think diversity is really important, and having a voice. And I think setting the scene at the start of each meeting. So we were quite transparent in the approach we were taking. We wanted... Yeah. I think previously when the standards were put together, they had specialists focusing in on the compounding standard, and now we wanted to take pharmacists from all areas of the profession just to make sure the standards covered everyone's practice settings. And so setting the scene at the start of meetings in terms of everyone is here for a reason, everyone comes from a different perspective. We had consumers in each meetings as well, and we wanted to hear from each person in the meeting. So letting them know that their voice was heard, everything was minuted. We obviously had meetings with the chairs beforehand to kind of discuss going around the room or how we would do that. And also, I guess, if there was anything that came out of the meetings that was a bit contentious, we were documenting that, taking it away and using online platforms as well to kind of discuss outside of meetings, because the meeting times are very limited and we really wanted to hear everyone's opinions there. So I think it's just making everyone aware of their reason why they're here and what we're trying to achieve, and being transparent in the setup of each group.
Yeah, fantastic. So it's really, I guess, what I'm hearing is creating that container for collaboration and what each person's role in that is, and what the parameters and how that collaboration is going to occur. You mentioned that you spoke with the chairs previously or before the meetings to talk about how the meeting, I guess, logistically was going to go. Were there any particular ways that you found really effective to have the voice of multiple people heard in meetings, or did it just vary?
That's a good question, because I think it definitely varies depending on the dynamics with the group as well. And obviously we would have meetings with the chair, and we talk. Every chair has their own unique style as well. So I don't think we wanted to be too restrictive in terms of this is how you should do it. I think it was more around setting the aims clearly and obviously having a clear agenda in terms of some questions that maybe have come up or some points of contention. I think one of the important things with each of the meetings is, I guess one of the challenges is if you've got groups of people working individually, which is great, but we also needed to keep them aware of what was happening across the whole project. So what was happening in the PAG and what was happening in the other SRG. So really setting the scene a bit more. So that's where we kind of stepped in and worked with the chair to do that at the start, and then working through the agenda. But in terms of discussing with the chair, it's more just making sure that everyone's voice was heard. So in some situations it would be going around the room, although we tried to avoid that so that the conversation flowed naturally. But
Yeah. Okay. So I'm also hearing that while there was these containers being really clear on the goal and the purpose and what outcomes were trying to be achieved, that framework seems like it allowed a lot of autonomy for the chairs and also within the meetings as well. So is that a fair assumption, or did you find that wasn't really the way it worked out?
No, I think that's a fair assumption. I think, the autonomy was definitely there. I think we would guide the conversation, or we would help in terms of what we were trying to achieve. But also setting the scene at the start of each meeting, like you mentioned, even though the project spanned just over 12 months, and I think there was about 4 or 5 individual SRG meetings. So you're looking at around 20 to 30 meetings externally, and then we obviously had internal meetings. At the start of those meetings, we would remind everyone of the aims that we were trying to achieve and what the outcome was that we were trying to achieve, to sort of reset the scene, I suppose. And obviously because there's a decent gap between each meeting, so just reminding everyone as well.
Yeah. So because I've got 2 questions here, but I'll start with this one first. Yes. Because it did span over such a long period of time, and you mentioned at the start that what you thought was the aim didn't really end up being the aim or the outcome that you ended up working towards at the end, and it was great that people flexed and came along on the journey with you. How did you identify, or how did you, I guess, structure going down various rabbit holes but not getting, I guess, too sidetracked from the end goal that you're trying to achieve, which was, developing these standards by a certain time as well? Yeah,
that's a really good point, because I think that was the biggest challenge. I think in terms of the aim, we were quite clear. We needed to revise the standards to make them more contemporary and more applicable to the pharmacy wider profession. As well as we wanted to implement findings from Deanna Mills' research work around EQUIP, so enhancing quality in pharmacy practice. So there were specific findings there that pharmacists perceived the resources difficult to access and use. So we knew that we needed to pull them back a bit, and also that we needed to make them more contemporary to enable the profession into the future and make them more adaptable. I guess the challenge that came from that is, like I said at the start, we thought we were going to do a bit of a quick touch up and remove some layers, but what ended up happening is that we mapped them around the medicine management cycle, and that was a bit of a discussion at the start around how that would look. And I think there was one point I remember quite well throughout the project where we thought we were, going quite well and steaming along, when we presented the standards in their draft formats to the project advisory group. I think some of the standards were mapped around a medicine management cycle, and some were still in the old form, like we had a specific dose administration aid standard, and we got quite a few questions around why is there this slight mismatch. So I think that was a bit of a turning point in the whole project, and we took that on board, I guess, internally, and the internal working group made quite a few changes. And we then presented that feedback to the standard review groups with the updated changes. And there was a lot of support from the members in terms of the way we were heading. But yeah, it resulted in it felt like each meeting we were starting with a big change each time rather than incremental small changes each time. So definitely a long process, but very valuable process as well.
Yeah, and look, again, I've said this to you before this podcast, but I think the big thing that I really adore about the new standards is, as someone who works not in a traditional scope, inverted commas, I feel really seen in these standards as well, and speaking to other people that they've felt the same. So I think that pivot that was done definitely seems for the better. The other question I had, and I guess when you're making these big changes, what seems like a big change at the start of each meeting, and you mentioned it earlier on that there are sometimes some contentious issues and, conflict or differences of opinion may arise. How were they managed?
I guess it comes back to that setting the scene at the start of each meeting in terms of the purpose and what we're trying to achieve, and making everyone aware of how the groups have been put together in terms of diverse opinions. And the groups were put together with people from different areas. If there were differing opinions that came up or points of contention in discussion at the meetings, we would let them flow and see how they happen. But also everything was minuted and noted, and we were letting the groups know we were taking that on board internally. So they were aware that we were having internal working group meetings every week between the bigger meetings, the SRG and the PAG meetings, and we were discussing any of those points of contention and reaching out to different members outside of the meetings to further research them, I suppose. And I guess it comes back to as well closing the loop or closing the circle. So letting the members know, we would send out minutes at the end of the meeting. These were the outcomes. At the start of the next meeting, we would then present what had happened and what work we had done and where we got to where we were, presenting the updated standard. Maybe action 5 was a bit contentious, so we've revised the wording based on X, Y, Z. Presenting that at the start of the meeting, I think, helps. And it also gives all the members an opportunity to have a chance to voice any concerns at that point as well, but being completely transparent in the way we were working. So we've taken that on board, we've discussed it, this is what we've come up with and these are the reasons why, and presenting that back to the group so that they're completely aware, because we needed everyone to understand why we got to where we were, because the standards are being developed by the whole group. It's a collaborative effort. So I think being transparent and closing the circle as well are important points.
That's incredible. There's so much to unpack there. So when we talk about emotional intelligence, in the competency of authenticity is this behaviour which is called the ability to facilitate robust debate. And when we're facilitating robust debate, it takes, well, at least in my mind, it takes away this idea of conflict being a negative thing, but being able to see various parts or various viewpoints, perspectives, unpacking unconscious bias, which we've spoken about before, and then being able to move forward with all of that information on the table. So I guess what I'm hearing as well is, like, in that transparency and that setting the scene, which was fantastic, it also allowed people to, I guess, I'm trying to choose my words here. It came to I guess what I'm hearing is that it allowed people to feel safe enough. I think that's where I'm trying to go. It's allowed people to feel safe enough to participate in this, knowing that there is going to be this I guess, critical analysis of these differing opinions, these different perspectives, these viewpoints. And then, as you said, closing the loop as well. So it doesn't go into the ether. And what I see sometimes in pharmacies is that, we go, oh, we give this feedback, and then it just disappears into the abyss. And they go, well, why did I bother? So that closing the loop, as you said, and, being able to report back on what was found and the steps and why it occurred, is such a really important part of that robust debate as well. So super, super cool.
Yeah, and I think closing that loop helps you to progress as well. And we really wanted to hear from everyone whether we were on the right path as well with what was intended in that meeting. Especially, I think having consumers in the meetings as well really added another level to the meetings and discussions as well, to hear their viewpoints. So not just from the pharmacists in the meetings, but also the consumers that were there, which then, it just added to that robust discussion. And I think you're right as well. Having everyone aware of the clear process and that their viewpoints were heard really helped with that as well, which is what we wanted in terms of how we were putting together the groups, having pharmacists working in different practice settings to give different opinions.
Yeah. It reads very comprehensively as well, which is, I guess another challenge in itself, having what goes on in those meetings come to life in a way that is being able to, be taken on board by the pharmacy profession as well. And I guess that's going to be the mark of success at the end of the day.
Yeah, the writing is a whole another complex level to it as well.
Yeah. Did you want to share something about that?
Yeah, I can do. I guess in terms of writing, I think writing standards is very different to writing guidelines or CPD, etc. I think there was a big learning curve there for the writing team, like myself and the external writer as well. And we were also wanting each standard to be following a specific format, which was aligning with some of Deanna Mills' work, so having a specific act or an action. And I think maybe with some previous versions of the standards, some of the actions may have two levels to it or may have two specific requirements in there, so it gets a little bit confusing. So we really tried to reduce the number of actions per standard to make it manageable, as well as making each standard a consistent structure so that pharmacists could clearly see what that action was asking them to do, bearing in mind they are the minimum performance expectations, so we didn't want to delve into the deep too much. So I think with each draft of the standards, the writing content changed significantly as well. But I'm glad to get your feedback in terms of where we landed and where we've gone with the final version.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say about Diana Mill's work and also about the importance of clarity around actions, because it was something that really stood out to me, is that it was very much focused on action. There's not ambiguity in the way it is written. It's something that, again, at least from my perspective, it's something that I can take that, one or two sentences and look at how I'm going to implement that into the way I practice as well. So I think when I'm talking about the clarity that I'm seeing, I think it really does come down to what you're saying there about making sure that information or that action was very clear and not too complex as well.
And widely applicable as well. I think that was one of obviously the standards are for every pharmacist in every practice setting and area of practice. So the standards needed to be widely applicable. So the wording was very carefully chosen to make sure it applies to pharmacists working in all settings.
Yeah, beautiful. So what were there any other challenges that you experienced along the way as the project lead that you'd care to share?
I think the biggest challenge that jumps to mind was just the overall journey. I guess that was a big journey that had lots of ups and downs. And I think internally we had a lot of meetings when we were coming up against points of contention. So it was kind of managing those and how we were discussing them. But I was very fortunate to work with a great group of people, and we were all open in discussion and could see others' viewpoints. And I think the best way of managing them was always coming back to what we were trying to achieve and how that linked into the end goal. It was mainly around linking to the medicine management cycle, and that was a big journey itself. I think there was a big shift to move away from standards that just focused in on a dose administration aid, for example, to this idea that now you need to think about the service you're going to provide, think about the steps involved in that, and then look at the standards and see how they align, so that now you are essentially piecing together a couple of standards to make one full standard for the service that you are providing. So I think that's a big shift for the profession as well. And I think we really wanted the standards to be a lot more flexible and adaptable to allow the profession to change into the future. So we know there's a lot of changes happening in the profession in the coming years. And so these standards have been designed to make them more flexible and adaptable. And I guess one of the other challenges we haven't spoken too much about is the implementation program. So, as part of the project, we've developed an online self-assessment implementation program, and that has been designed to educate pharmacists about the standards as well as how you put them together. So it's quite interactive, and that itself was quite a challenge, because obviously that was being developed alongside the standards, and the standards kept changing. So the program ideal kept changing as well. So that resulted in, I think, communication is the key. A lot of meetings with the external company to develop the program, and keeping them informed of the changes of why we were doing them, and maybe obviously being in the centre of it all. I had the oversight of what was changing, so I could inform the external company in terms of, hang on, let's just hold that for a second. We've got a meeting in 2 weeks. Let's not progress, and see what the outcome of that meeting is, because I don't want us to start developing something and then go back on it. So I think, regular meetings and open communication helps.
Yeah. A bit more of a personal question for you, Jake.
Yeah.
You said there that, you're in the centre of it all. What systems do you use to kind of keep across so many different moving parts?
That's a good question.
Or is there a way that you'd like to do it better, if that's more appropriate?
Yeah, there's my ideal and there's my actual, I think.
Yeah, valid.
I think my way of keeping on top of it probably reflected the ups and downs with the project as well. I think we did use Teams a lot, like Teams, like an online platform to communicate and collaborate. So having documents to work on that were living, because we had a few externals that we were working with as well, as the SRG members and PAG members. We did use like online collaboration tools, but I also had a clear project timeline just mapped out, so that I had an idea around where our key deliverables were and what was dependent on what. So did this need to be completed before we could progress to that? And also just being prepared before meetings. I think for me to be prepared to know what to discuss in the meetings and what decisions we needed to be made, more around the internal working group decisions, to make sure that the timeline was being followed, because obviously managing projects, they always tend to change. But we did have a hard deadline with this, because we were going to print. So obviously we can't stop the printers. So we did have a hard deadline. So it was using the online tools and keeping on top of that all. But I think in reality, I was working across different things and had different documents everywhere, but just bringing it all together for meetings and getting thoughts clear, so that you could use the valuable time you had quite well. Yeah. So really knowing what those priorities were around the key deliverables, and at the times allowed you to, I guess, hone your focus where it needed to be, as opposed to, I guess, trying to look at everything all at once, which might get a little bit confusing. That was a good takeaway from my messy answer.
So a lot of our audience are frontline pharmacists, managers, owners, clinicians. I guess putting you on the spot, but if you were to take away some key learnings that you would take back into community pharmacy or smaller teams, even, hospital teams, what do you think might be relevant to our listeners who are on the front line?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, without saying, I think, I guess everything in the standards is relevant to some degree, but I guess my take homes would be around the adaptability and flexibility we have as a profession. I think we have all these skills already, and it's putting those skills into practice. And I think the standards, we've really tried to make it clear, like putting this in the standards context around what the minimum are. And I guess some that really come through initially is just around, like, there's standards now around patient assessment and prescribing. And these are areas that pharmacists we do them every day on the front line, but we may not give ourselves the recognition that we do this. So we've really tried to put that into the standards to show this is what we're doing every day, and this is what, as a profession, we are able to do. So we've put that into, like, specific standards and actions to help guide pharmacists a bit more clearly, I suppose, if there's any uncertainty with that. Another one that jumps to mind is just around the documentation. So documentation is really important, and that's something that's included in the standards as well as part of service delivery. And I think if you can document your interactions and reasons for thinking, however you work, like that can improve patient outcomes as well and transitions of care.
Yeah. Great takeaways. And something that really stuck with me when I sat in on the webinar about the presenting of the services, and I don't want to direct quote Professor Nissen, but she said something to the effect of, our role as pharmacists now in terms of these standards is to take them, run with them, and use them to, I guess, advance our profession and see whether we can break them. So, how far can we stretch them? And it's something that really stuck. It was something that really stuck with me, that I thought, if that was the mentality that everyone came into this whole process with, what an exciting opportunity to advance our profession as well, and to evolve it and really take advantage, full scope of practice, which is, the slogan on everyone's lips right about now as well. So I think that also is kind of summarised in what you're saying there as well, about being able to embed them into what we're doing and see how we can use them even more effectively too.
Yeah, we wanted the standards to empower pharmacists to be able to practice to full scope, to make changes to your practice, to go into areas you may not be, or introduce new services, for example. So the standards were specifically written the way they have been written to make it quite clear, to give pharmacists the ability and confidence to practice to full scope and take on new challenges. Yeah. And we know the profession is changing. There's a lot of changes happening now, and there's more to come in the future as well. So we're really hoping the standards are the building block or the foundation that can help advance the profession in that way.
Absolutely. Exciting times. So bringing this back to your leadership or your role as the lead in this project, you've used words like, you've spoken about transparency a lot, you've spoken about communication a lot, you've spoken about, setting the scene and keeping that kind of long-term goal, the aim at the front, and being able to close the feedback loop around contentious issues, or even just, analysing what comes out of meetings and whatnot. What have you learnt from the process as a leader that you're going to take forward with you? I guess the really important parts of this, or what other advice could you impart to our leaders in our listening audience too?
I think, it's more around being quite clear with, what you said, what you're trying to achieve, and really, I think it's quite easy to get sidetracked and lose focus of what the scope is that you're trying to achieve, especially when you're working with essentially 40 pharmacists with very different opinions. So we've got, 3 different SRGs and a PAG, and it's quite easy to go down a bit of a rabbit hole and get sidetracked. So I think reminding yourself what you're trying to achieve and what the outcome is that you want, and bringing that back, because I think with each iteration of the standards, for example, we would take on feedback and we'd look at that feedback, and then we'd have to you would reset. So it's just, I think taking it back to the aim and what you're wanting to achieve, because it's quite easy everyone's feedback is valuable, and you do want to include everyone's feedback and, show everyone's voice is heard, but it's also that balancing act between, is that then going outside of the scope? And if we start doing that, how far down that path do we go till we say that's enough? Or just taking it right back and really reminding ourselves, we wanted to achieve standards that are quite clear and concise and actionable. And does that then add complexity to it if we include X, Y, Z there? So, I think that's my biggest take home, I think.
Yeah. And so important, even in terms of level of engagement. And, we can talk about engagement of the 40-odd pharmacists that you're dealing with, but if we look at engagement of the profession, one of the key needs of engagement is to understand the purpose. And it sounds like that's what you kept coming back to as well. What's the aim? What's the purpose of this? And, this is the minimum standards, and we want these to be accessible and practical and useful for everyone. So, such a great takeaway. So the last question I want to ask you, Jake, is one that I ask all of my guests. This year I have been building a leader's toolbox, and I want to know, if you could only put one tool into this pharmacist leader's toolbox, what would it be?
I'd like to put 5 in, but maybe I think the one that really jumps up the forefront is just being transparent in processes. So transparent in decisions and why decisions are made, and transparent in processes and what you're doing and why you're doing it, which links into working collaboratively as well. So that having everyone's voice is heard. But I think, transparency is what I would put in there.
Yeah, I like how you got your extra few in there that way. That was impressive.
You can take your pick.
No, look, I think transparency is a great one, and I think you underpinned it with lots of really good reasons of why it is super important. And I think even from a personal perspective, we can't always appease everyone. We can't always say yes to everyone, but by at least being able to explain our reasoning behind this, and being able to, be as open as possible. While they might not agree, they can at least respect why it's come to the decision that it is. So I think that's a fantastic inclusion. So that, I think, it has been just a wonderful chat, and it's been so nice for you to take us behind the 40-odd page document that we all see and will utilise and engage with in the self-assessment tool and beyond. But thank you so much for being here today. And is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, just to say thank you for having me, and thank you for letting me discuss this as well. I think it's really important for pharmacists to be aware of the changes and why changes have happened and where the standards sit. I look forward to hearing any feedback as well. Thank you for the chat.
Thank you. It has been thoroughly enjoyable.
Thanks for joining us today on the Pharmacy View podcast, and don't forget to like, share, and leave us a comment if you found this episode of value or have feedback. Podcast episodes are promoted through social media, LinkedIn, YouTube, and major podcast mediums, and each episode can be found on the Pharmacy View webpage with links to guest contact and business details. If you're a pharmacist or industry support supplier who would like to join us on an episode, send us a message through LinkedIn or complete an inquiry form on the Pharmacy View webpage. I am your host, Chantelle Turner, pharmacist, leadership coach, and founder of Turn Pharmacy Leadership. And on behalf of Shopfront Solutions and Arion Technologies, Thanks again for joining us today on the Pharmacy View podcast.